The following video contains references to sexual violence. Viewer discretion is advised.
If you've been around long enough, when you think of a high-stakes isolation thriller set on the open ocean, one movie immediately pops to the surface. Philip Noyce's 1989 Australian gut punch, Dead Calm. It's got the essentials. Sam Neill looking reliably stressed, Nicole Kidman proving she's much more than just Tom Cruise's future wife, and Billy Zane, bless his heart, delivering a performance so unhinged, it's basically the platonic ideal of the psychopathic outsider. But here's the thing about a movie that feels this streamlined, this perfectly engineered for tension. It didn't just emerge from a void. It's something more than a routine piece of 1980s survival horror. It's actually a really fascinating and, frankly, viciously effective piece of historical cinema. It's a film that mastered the genre by openly and skillfully stealing from the best, then realizing that for the late 1980s, the audience needed something completely different. The question isn't whether Dead Calm is a great thriller, it is. The question is, how did it take a decades-old cinematic template, and by ruthlessly modernizing its themes, create a blueprint for the modern psychonautical thriller? This video contains spoilers, so consider watching the film first before you continue. And if you like what you see, click the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to click the little bell to be notified for new videos. Now before we deep dive into the choppy waters of cinematic history, let's quickly recap the sheer, concentrated misery of the plot, because it's important to remember just how dire things get. The premise is deceptively simple. You have John and Ray Ingram, a nice, wealthy, grieving couple played by Neill and Kidman, who have taken their beautiful yacht, the Saracen, out onto the Pacific to cope with the recent death of their young son. It's a trauma vacation, essentially. Sidebar: Sam Neill was 39 at the time this was filmed, and Nicole Kidman was 19 going on 20. It seems like their kid was about 12 to 18 months. I'm gonna let you decide how icky that math makes you feel. Anyway, back to it. Because this is a thriller and not a brochure, their piece is immediately interrupted by the arrival of a seemingly disabled schooner, the Orpheus. They find one survivor, Huey, played by a sweaty, twitchy, vaguely handsome Billy Zane. Huey claims everyone on the ship died of dysentery thanks to some bad canned salmon. John, ever the rational, competent husband, rows over to the Orpheus to investigate. And when he does, he finds the boat is a disaster area, littered with dead bodies, and also video evidence that Huey is, and this is the technical term, a total psychopath. This was no boat accident. Huey, realizing he's been rumbled, acts fast, cutting the line to the Orpheus, leaving John to be dragged away into the middle of the ocean, and taking Ray hostage on the Saracen. The conflict is established. Ray is now trapped on an isolated boat with a highly effective killer, while her husband is trapped on a derelict boat, slowly sinking somewhere nearby. It's a cat-and-mouse game with literally nowhere to run. Which brings us to the real fun, the film's structural parentage. To understand Dead Calm, you have to understand the ghost it's sailing alongside. And there are two big ones, each representing a road not taken by Noyce and his phenomenal production team. First, you have the specter of Orson Welles, probably best known for his love of frozen peas. The film is based on a 1963 novel by Charles Williams, and Welles spent years trying and failing to adapt it into a film called The Deep. Welles was drawn to the original novel's classical tragedy in its confined setting. He wanted to make a deep existential meditation on fate and character, but the project famously sank after the death of star Lawrence Harvey. Why does that matter? Because Noyce and producer George Miller's team, yes, George Miller of Mad Max fame, made a crucial decision. They traded Welles's art house aspirations for the cold, efficient mechanism of Hitchcockian suspense. They weren't making a philosophical study. They were making a mousetrap to wring out every last bit of pure visceral survival tension. And that brings us to the more important ghost, the actual structural precedent for this whole shebang. Roman Polanski's 1962 film, Knife in the Water. Knife in the Water is the seminal psychosexual nautical thriller. It established the claustrophobic constraints and the thematic blueprint that Dead Calm consciously replicates. The setup is identical. A married couple on a sailboat and the arrival of a predatory outsider who weaponizes the internal discord between them. But Polanski's film is a study in existential ambiguity and Marxist class conflict. The tension is intellectual. The knife, the yacht's mast, it's all Freudian symbolism and competition between the men for dominance and the woman's attention. And at the end, spoiler alert from 1962, nothing is resolved. Dead Calm said, "That's cute, Polanski, but we're in the late 1980s now? We don't have time for your intellectual European angst." They stripped out the ambiguity, thus carving out their own narrative niche. Huey isn't some complex class rival, he's a certified undeniable murderer from minute one. For the audience, obviously not Ray and John. The conflict instantly shifts from who controls the marital space to primal immediate survival. This generic shift from a philosophical exercise to a pure psycho-thriller is the key to situating dead common history. It was released at a critical time for Australian cinema, moving away from government-subsidized local dramas and into the market for high-end commercial genre exports. What you might call high-concept Ozploitation. The film had to be globally marketable. An intellectual ambiguity just doesn't pay the global bills. The filmmakers realized they could trade the heady themes of Polanski for a narrative centered on gendered survival and the processing of personal trauma. In Knife in the Water, the boat is a playing field for male competition. In Dead Calm, the Saracen is immediately established as a floating metaphor for the Ingrams' marriage. A physical manifestation of Ray Ingram's unresolved grief over the death of her son, and John Ingram's denial over his lack of control. The ocean isn't a symbol for male conflict, it's a liquid prison. A space of passive mourning. Huey's arrival is the external catastrophe necessary to force Ray and John into action. By removing John, the established competent male authority figure, Huey clears the stage for the film's real gendered drama. The psychosexual threat Huey poses is more than sensationalism. It's the ultimate violation that forces the heroine Ray out of her trauma-induced paralysis. John, out of an abundance of empathy, had been sheltering Ray emotionally so that she didn't have to deal with her trauma. Now with him out of the way, she's forced to abandon the expectation of rescue, the patriarchal promise of protection, and embrace a radical self-reliant agency. The yacht becomes a battleground for her selfhood. But getting there forces the audience through some choppy waters, so I'm about to discuss some issues of consent surrounding Ray and Huey's sexual power dynamics. It's one of the most remembered sequences of the film, and, like Straw Dogs before it, one of the most controversial in how it's framed. I'll just say this. The Dennis Reynolds implication speech is a lot less funny when you watch it play out in real time.
There's nowhere for me to run. What am I gonna do, say no?
Okay, so Huey expects a certain dynamic, right? He's already dominated Ray physically. She's the captive woman who will either passively resist or meekly submit. He anticipates the damsel in distress, but Ray delivers an award-winning performance of sexual availability to get him to let his guard down. She deliberately engages in this facade of submission, allowing him into the cabin, accepting the physical contact, appearing to consent. It's a gambit of unsettlingly effective feigned compliance. She consciously performs the role of victim that a predator expects, instantly subverting it. She uses the male gaze, the rapist's expectation of dominance, as her tactical tool, turning her perceived weakness into a weapon aimed directly at his Adam's apple. This act is her first successful reterritorialization on the Saracen. By taking control of the social dynamic and leading him to the most vulnerable space, she momentarily claims power. This moment essentially requires Ray to accept that the world is sometimes chaotic and malicious, and she doesn't have control over that. So letting guilt and shame keep a vice grip on her is not helpful. The only hope is resisting and fighting back in the way that she knows how.
Phillip.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you read my mind.
Now, we have to pump the brakes here and talk about the obvious unavoidable problem. Because while this sequence functions brilliantly as a structural catalyst for Ray's transformation, pushing her past the point of passive mourning and activating her primal agency, it leans heavily into the deeply problematic rape revenge trope that was so common in exploitation and mainstream thrillers of the era. By making the threat of sexual assault the key event that spurs the female protagonist into action, the narrative implicitly suggests that a woman's power is contingent upon the trauma of sexual violation. It's cinema reducing female motivation to a reactive response to male violence, instead of an inherent capacity for action. We're using societal trauma as a source of spectacle and plot tension. It's narratively effective, but ethically messy, and we have to acknowledge that. But here's where the film finds a tiny bit of grace. The act, the self-violation, solidifies her status as the film's avenging protagonist. This is Ray's point of no return. The world of the Saracen is gone. It's now the battleground. Ray must now adopt the ruthlessness of her environment, fully graduating from grieving wife to unambiguous warrior. At this point, she's no longer John's wife or Danny's mother. She's Ray. And she's found her own survival instinct. Unfortunately, and this is my second content warning, Ray's initial sexual gambit is unsuccessful, resulting in the death of the Ingram's dog, Ben. So, yes, something bad happens to the dog. We established John Ingram as the quintessential competent patriarch, Navy background, always knows how to fix a problem. His trauma is fundamentally different from Ray's. While Ray suffers from the paralysis of grief, John carries the guilt of failed protection. The car crash that killed their son shattered his self-concept as a competent husband. The Saracen was his attempt to restore that control. He manages the isolation, he fixes the boat. He seeks to fix Ray and their marriage through competence, not emotional vulnerability. His decision to row to the Orpheus is his final, fatal act of hubristic control, believing his expertise will allow him to manage the danger. So Huey doesn't just strand John, he casts him onto the Orpheus, the symbolic antithesis of everything John stands for. Thematically, the Orpheus isn't just a sinking boat. It's a straitjacket of helplessness. It's a tomb, a site of chaos and moral decay, a completely out-of-control space where John's carefully curated competence has to be jettisoned and replaced with instinct. As John stumbles through the detritus of the ship, trying to figure out what happened like a nautical Sherlock Holmes, his situation grows more dire the more he learns about the irrationality of Huey and what actually happened. His emotional objective, to save his wife, is constantly frustrated by a mechanical, technical reality. The broken hull, the rising water. It's almost a meta-commentary. John, the one who understands the diegesis of the boat, finds all his paratextual knowledge useless against the pure narrative chaos. His struggle becomes a desperate, hands-on battle against forces utterly beyond his control. This fight, waged in the muck and death of the foreign vessel, is John's cathartic confrontation with his own internal chaos. It forces him to accept the terrifying, humbling truth that competence is insufficient in the face of irrationality. The genius of the film's structure here is the parallel struggle. Ray is fighting a psychological engendered battle to reclaim her body and her mind. John is fighting a technical and existential battle to reclaim his will, his capacity for action, even when stripped of all control. He doesn't save Ray with a clean, heroic action. He survives his own personal apocalypse and drives a half-sunk wreck through a storm. That final desperate act is a primal assertion of will, not just an act of engineering. Dead Calm is not a perfect film. We have to talk about that tacked-on ending, which is pure 1980s slasher movie cliche. You know the cliche. You think the monster is dead, you sigh with relief, and then bam! One last jump scare, followed by the definitive final death. Monster dies, roll credits. The original ending saw Ray dump Huey over the side on the life raft and sail to the Orpheus to save John. Test audiences apparently thought the original ending was too ambiguous about Huey's fate, though, so they stapled on a final fright that mostly undoes the previous 2 hours worth of catharsis, as John has to save helpless Ray from Huey's Jason Voorhees-like resurrection. It's asinine, it ruins the pace of the film, and it completely undoes the theme that they worked so hard to establish. And given that the filmmakers changed it to appease test audiences, I don't think I'm being dramatic here when I say this is the single greatest piece of evidence for getting rid of democracy. In the end, Dead Calm's real legacy is threefold. It was a definitive star-making vehicle that put Nicole Kidman on the global map. It fulfilled the long-dreamed-of adaptation that Orson Welles spent so much blood and emotional treasure for. And 3, it re-territorialized the Polanski nautical thriller template. It said, we can use this brilliant confined structure, but we're swapping out that remote intellectual examination of class for a brutally efficient, cathartic narrative focused on the emergence of a strong, resourceful female protagonist. The monster wasn't solely Huey. The monster was the anxiety of a genre, and a society trying to figure out what happens when the hero isn't a man, but a woman who refuses to be a victim. And that, my friends, is a story that definitely deserves a sequel. Stay warm, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, 1 hand for the boat and 1 hand for yourself. Make good choices, and I'll see you next time.